Thanks very much. Thanks, Yusuf. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, all the organizers. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see you. I'm really thrilled to be presenting this work to this group, celebrating and thinking about Jung, and also very happy to be following Richard Tarnas's amazing talk. Fantastic that he's doing a lot of things that I wouldn't dare to do, but he's talking about history, which is what I'm talking about. And I don't know if that's the focus everywhere, but how did we get to the moment we're in? How did Jung become who he was? And how did he come to have the influence that he's had that brings us all here 150 years later? And those are the kinds of questions that I'm asking. Not so much how can Jung help understand the present, but how is Jung already active in the present? How did he enter into many different conversations and in some ways into the mainstream as a resource for thinking about all kinds of things? So is Jung actually part of the modern world? Undoubtedly. He is behind many important and best-selling books, novels, Alchemist, Eat, Pray, Love, but also roots of creativity that are bestsellers like Rick Rubin's very recent Creative Act and The Artist's Way, which is sold millions of copies and informs a lot of the creative work that's being produced today. And of course, increasingly, I think in the online world, we are seeing an influence of Jungian notions for self-help, self-transformation. This was the kind of shocker self-published bestseller of a couple of years ago, The Shadow Work Journal. Everyone is encouraged to delve into their psyches, their unconscious, and especially focus on the dark side, the hidden aspects of themselves in lots of ways. I also believe that Jung is behind or very much an influence on the popularization of Asian practices of self-transformation in Western cultures. The East-West meeting that is behind this meeting today. Yoga, mindfulness, and often very advanced techniques of Buddhist, Taoist, Hindu meditation. So how does this happen? What form does it take? I think there's a particular resonance currently between Jungian notions and online culture. For one, it's very easy to have access to a lot of Jungian notions. You can just click. You don't have to go through therapy. You don't have to read a book. You can just click on a website. But there's a particular way of thinking and way of interacting with the self online that lends itself to certain aspects of Jungian ideas. One aspect of this is the notion that everyone is a particular individual, and yet what makes you an individual is to be a combination of a number of definable traits, relatively definable traits. So the personality typing that he innovated and then was taken up by Myers-Briggs, that's a form of a kind of algorithmic understanding of the self. You are the product at any given moment of a combination of different factors put together in a specific form, in a specific typing. That combinatorial conception of the self, which you can access immediately online, you put in certain answers to the questionnaire and it tells you who you are, of course has deeper and varied roots, even before Jung's typing, going back to astrology, which again is everywhere online and often presented nowadays with a Jungian undertone, right? The houses, the signs, the constellations, each correspond to archetypal entities. And Liz Green and her friends have really promoted this way of seeing, and there are many other schools that work in this way. But this online divination and self-exploration that I think has very clear Jungian roots also plays out in online I Ching consultations, online tarot consultation, where again, the Jungian archetypal dimension is very present. So you're able to find out who you are and explore yourself in part by interacting with the readily available and personalized experience of online existence. Another route that we're all familiar with, through which Jung has entered the mainstream, is through the cinema. The Star Wars, of course, is very influenced by Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, itself drawing on Jung's archetypal notions, and the fact that so many Hollywood screenwriters are worrying about their next, will they have a hit? And they're talking to their therapists about this, who are often Jungian therapists. I think creates a kind of perfect loop of Jungian notions getting fed into the movies. And the explosion and ongoing continuation of superhero films as kind of the big blockbusters is a way in which Jungian notions of archetype, hero's journey, feed to a wider audience. That continues up to today. The Black Panther films, there are scenes of an initiation, right? The heart-shaped herb that the Black Panther takes, which brings him to the ancestral plane, almost like literally the archetypal plane where he confronts his father. This is straight out of a Jungian playbook. More recently in Wakanda Forever, his sister Shuri also goes onto the ancestral plane, drinking the psychedelic ibogaine-influenced heart-shaped herb. And there she encounters not her father, but the shadow figure, Erich Killmonger. So if you've seen the film, you especially if you've read Jung beforehand, you're on familiar territory in that scene. And so I think there's a way in which a lot of aspects that Jung brought together are showing up in scenes like this. The drawing on comparative religious studies, anthropology, and in this case, Pan-Africanism, Ibogaine, and the Bwiti cult. The idea of a ritual process, initiation or coronation, separation from the group and then return to the normal world, encountering spirit animals through myths, and a vision quest. And they're mythical beings, archetypal beings, the king, the senex, the father, the shadow, and this remarkable combination which you see in Star Wars, but I also think is part of what Jung was talking about in Reckoning with the Modern World, a combination of the archaic, right, the eternal and ancient, with the very modern and the high tech, and sometimes even the futuristic. So his writings on UFOs, in a way, are predecessors for scenes like this. So I don't think I have to argue at length to this group to say that Jung has had an influence on the present world, but I think elsewhere, it does take some arguing. For a long time, an idea that was knocking around was that the 20th century was the Freudian century. And through clinical work, through medicine and through official psychiatry, and through academic work, Freud did have a profound impact on the 20th century. But I think Jung has entered the conversation through other routes, less through the university, less through the medical establishment, much more through popular routes, through popular culture, through the arts, and through popular discourses that we see now really magnified and amplified online. So rather than a Freudian century, I'd suggest that we are in a Jungian century, which might have started maybe around 1950. And it's really heating up now. And here we are. And that would be a kind of route from the counterculture, Jungian ideas in the counterculture, into mainstream popular culture by the 1980s, and now in online divination and self-knowledge in the present. Now, when I say that this is a Jungian century, I don't mean to say that there are vast numbers of people who have closely read Jung or who understand all of his concepts, as though that were possible, right, to understand them all in depth. Or that there are particular students of Jung who have transmitted a fixed body of ideas, right, taught the doctrine in an exact way. There are all kinds of squabbles, as you all know, about the right interpretation, about his voluminous works, just what he's saying on any given page. So it's not as though there's a kind of Jungian complex that then gets transmitted directly into the wider world. Instead, I'd like to think about a Jungian milieu, a Jungian atmosphere or an ambience, a certain way of thinking, a certain attitude, a certain style of thought, a certain set of possibilities. And that's what I think is both the carrier and the thing that is carried by many different routes into the mainstream. Okay, it's the vessel and the thing that's carried. What does it include? Well, the notion of archetypes, but archetypes themselves are very ambiguous entities, but to have some idea of what an archetype is part of this milieu. Archaism, the sense that you are living both in the present and in the ancient past in some way. Then actualization, that there's something that is there in the unconscious or there in the past that's brought forward, and in a very particular way, in an individual way, due to the kairos of who you are at a given moment. But then, very importantly, again, ambiguity, that it's not always clear how to interpret these concepts or what they mean from one moment to the next, one setting to the next. There is a metaphysical ambiguity, particularly around the notion of archetypes. Are these coming from inside the house? Are they coming from inside the mind? Are they translations of universal biological phenomena? Are they real existing metaphysical beings? If you're talking to an archetype, is this a spirit? Is this a communication with an entity that's outside of your mind? That ambiguity, I think Jung is extremely artful in keeping open in his work. And that ambiguity is there in how he's received. Do you have to believe in the reality of, say, spirits, non-physical things, in order to encounter the archetypes? Not necessarily. You could read them in either way. At the same time, I'd say that there's an ethical ambiguity. All of the interest that Jung puts into the shadow, right? The response to Joe, the possibility of a harmful God, right? A God who doesn't want well, who wants to destroy, and the destructive, negative impulses that we all have, that we need to somehow recognize, not only recognize, but embrace, leads to all kinds of ethical quandaries, right? This isn't just a narrative of here's the good, follow the good, be good. Rather, the bad, the evil is there as well, and it's a challenge to know how any of the experiences one has along the paths that are opened should be followed, right? Because there are dangers on every side. So both the metaphysical and an ethical, and then by consequence, a political ambiguity, right? What kind of social order is implied by living this path, by encountering the archetypes in this way? So that to me is the general kernel of the Jungian milieu, and it's how Jung-ish ideas, if not Jung's own ideas, but Jung-ish ideas, are experienced in the modern world, in the contemporary world. And how did they reach the modern world? As I say, a lot of them are there now online, but before that, they had to spread into more people's minds. And I'm going to suggest in this historically based paper that this place that you may have heard about, but might not have, is really the source for the mainstreaming of a lot of Jung's ideas. And it's Eranos. Eranos means banquet in ancient Greek. And the idea, it was a set of meetings that were held in Ascona, Switzerland, starting in 1933, where different scholars, historians of ideas, religious scholars, some scientists, psychologists, some artists, some poets, would join together and each would bring an offering, right? It was like a big picnic. They'd bring their idea and they'd share amongst them. And this table at Eranos was kind of a symbol of the open conversation and sharing that happened there. But there were also very formal lectures. That's Jung right there. And I'm not sure who's giving a speech, but that was part of it as well. 2-hour lectures in German, French, Italian, and English. That's how these ideas were transmitted. And people exchanged ideas and spent a week there together. So they sunk into this milieu, right? They really marinated in this milieu. And I think of Eranos as a kind of laboratory for cultivating this milieu and creating it, and sending, creating a kind of milieu where the notion of archetype and all the other aspects of the Jungian milieu could merge with the expertise and interests of the different scholars that were brought there, as well as the audience, which was about 50 people, and from there, springboard out into the wider world, right? Through when they returned back to their homes, their ideas had a kind of archetypal spin on them, a Jungian spin on them. They didn't become Jungians, but they spoke in a way that could be understood by others who spoke with Jung. Okay, so Jung was a kind of coordinating influence for these many different ideas. Just a quick snapshot of the fun that was being had drinking tea afterwards. Jung is actually there at the conferences until the start of the 60s, 61, 62. But the real organizer and the person whose house it is Olga Fröbe-Kapteyn. Okay, so that's her there. And without her, it would never have happened. And she took the project of Eranos, onto herself as a kind of mission and very much as a Jungian project of individuation. This is how she realized herself, through bringing scholars together in this framework. So this was my introduction. These are some of the points I hope to cover. And if there is time, I'll get to a coda about the spiritual but not religious. So that's just a route that we're going to follow. So first, setting the table in Ascona. Olga Fröbe-Kapteyn is the center of it. It's her house in Ascona. She's born, she's about 6 years older or younger than Jung, born in England. Her father is a Dutch scientist. Her mother is a feminist and activist. The anarchist Peter Kropotkin once hung out at their house. So both an intellectual and a politically activist environment she grew up in. She marries a Hungarian composer named Fröbe. Kapteyn's her birth name. He moves her to Switzerland and then to Berlin. Then he dies in a plane crash. And she then relocates to Ascona, Switzerland, which is on the Italian side of Switzerland. So the language around her is Italian. Buys this gorgeous house called Casa Gabriella on Lake Maggiore, on the shores of the lake. And in 1928 decides, sort of following a dream, to build a conference center there, to build a large room in which lectures can be held. And it's still there, and it's where Eranos has been held ever since. Why Ascona, Switzerland? Well, one of the things that's already happening just up the road from Casa Gabriella is the former sanatorium, which is now a kind of, which in the 1920s, 10s, 20s, 30s, was a kind of intentional community, bohemian exploratory space, a bit like Esalen, a bit like San Francisco in the 1960s. It was often seen as an additional borough to Berlin, where all the bohemians and artists would spend a month or a year doing art, doing drugs, having sexual experimentation, dancing, reading and writing philosophy. Isadora Duncan spent time there. Kafka spent time there. Hermann Hesse spent time there. The dancer Rudolf Laban organized mystical dances there. They were also very interested in theosophy and spiritualism, and the occult, actually. And a number of followers of Crowley wound up at Ascona at Monte Verita as well. One of the people who was drawn there was Alice Bailey, who is an important figure in the history of the New Age. She coins the term. She is a theosophist. More on that in a second. And she becomes very good friends with Olga, and she actually lives in her house for a while. Olga is an artist. She is, in the 1910s and 20s, painting a series of stencils and screen prints like this, which often have theosophical, spiritualist underpinnings. She calls them meditation plates at times. They emerge in her meditation, but they often have the imagery of a kind of mandala, often crosses, triangles representing the Trinity, a kind of spiritual ascent, the interaction between a descending triangle and a rising triangle, which you see a lot in theosophy. Spirit goes down as matter rises up, and everything interesting happens in between the two, at the intersection of those two triangles. So theosophy is a very influential, somewhat forgotten movement, not necessarily here, but outside of this building, that has an international impact from the 1870s onward. Helena Blavatsky and Olcott are some of the leaders. A belief in universal brotherhood, karma, reincarnation, a kind of universal consciousness that is separated out into the individual, and mankind will live forever in some form. It's a synthesis of many different religions. It's a kind of perennialism that gets digested into a single doctrine. Swami Vivekananda here, recent book about him, Guru to the World, is promoting theosophy and especially making Vedanta and Hindu notions part of the formula, part of the theosophist formula. People like William James, Henry Bergson are very influenced by theosophy as well. And so around 1900, this is a kind of very optimistic international interfaith formation where spiritual practice and experience is just as important as doctrine. After Blavatsky, one of the leaders of theosophy is Annie Besant, and Alice Bailey wants to overthrow her, and wants to really put herself at the lead of the theosophical organization. She wants to get back to the roots of Blavatsky, not Annie Besant, and Olga's got this great house, and she knows lots of people in Switzerland. This would be a good base for it. Olga Fröbe-Kapteyn, as I said, was an artist, also designed her own clothing to be both somewhat Indian and also classical Greek. So she was into making this not more than just a set of ideas, but very much a lifestyle. But Alice Bailey's daughters would get into trouble up on the mountain in Monte Verita, and her husband would sunbathe nude at Lake Maggiore, and eventually Olga said this can't go on and kicked her out. So she went on to theosophical adventures elsewhere, creating a void in Olga's life, which she looked to fill in part by going to the School of Wisdom, which was a organized set of conferences in Darmstadt from the 1920s, organized by Hermann Graf von Keyserling, a very colorful Baltic figure, who was writing in a theosophical mode about the evolution of spirit and the way in which different kinds of spiritual and religious trainings worldwide might be synthesized to bring about a new kind of revelation, a new kind of humanity. Among the very prominent figures who showed up at the School of Wisdom were Rabindranath Tagore, the Bengali poet and visionary, Paul Tillich, who we just heard about, a friend of Frederick Spiegelberg. Hermann Hesse himself was there. Also Rudolf Otto, who is an important theologian, philosopher of religions, who in The Idea of the Holy talked about the tremendous and fascinating mystery that's at the base of all religions, the experience of the holy. And he's the one who puts into circulation the term the numinous. All religions are basically about spiritual experience. The doctrine is just an addition afterwards. And that experience is this encounter with this terrifying, massive mystery. And all humans are disposed towards this, which is why religion in some form is a universal phenomenon. And this is where, in 1930, Olga Fröbe-Kapteyn meets Jung, who is there giving lectures. Whereas Jung at this point, well, he's no longer the crown prince of Freudian psychoanalysis. He's had his break in the 19-teens. He's taken his descent into hell and the experience and the encounter with the archetypal unconscious that he renders in images, renders in the prophetic text that will become the Red Book, and has synthesized, has arrived at from 1917, more or less, his view of the unconscious and the importance of the archetype, which is what he was in direct contact with through active imagination in the Red Book. And again, the ambiguity of the archetype is important. Is it a vehicle of energy? Is it just a unit of myth? Is it a record of developmental biological universals that all species and all humans have gone through? Or is it an active autonomous entity? Is it a kind of spirit? Is it a living thing? That ambiguity continues. He goes to visit Olga at her house, where her images, her screen prints are shown. That's not him, that's another theosophist who she's chatting with, but that is Olga. And he looks at them and says, "You cannot paint this way. This is the very devil. The edges are all too sharp. The colors are all too stark." So she says, "Okay, Carl, wow. All right, I'm going to change my ways." She adopts a much different style, a more vague, a more flowing, more pastel style, focused on introspection, where she's a figure. Here she is, a dream that she had of bleeding, holding a dove. Here she is looking into the pool of her own unconscious. And here we see her starting a series that shows her at the center of cosmic forces that she's drawing to her. Here at the center of a net, standing here, where different consciousnesses are being drawn to her, that she's holding together. She's bringing people to her house Casa Gabriela, this is a rendering of it, which is her womb, right? Which will give birth to a new humanity. She is seeing herself as taking on a very important cosmic role, and Eranos, her building, the house where people will be gathered, will bring about the new age that Alice Bailey had told her was possible. So this is not just a hobby for her. This is a full-time occupation and a true calling to bring together her own ideas from theosophy, spiritualism, and the New Age, the ideas of Jung at the time, wanting to advance, develop his psychological science, but begin to expand it in conversation with other religious traditions. So bring in people who are experts on Islam, on Buddhism, on Taoism, on Hinduism, and see how their language of self-transformation, of individual experience, can be translated into the language of archetypes, into the language of Jungian psychology, and also promote what he's doing, bring it out into the wider world, make new allies in other parts of the world and in other academic disciplines to increase the academic legitimacy of psychoanalysis, which was very much threatened by the break with Freud. Right? But then the third point of this triangle are the visiting scholars who are brought to the round table, who study world traditions primarily through their mystical content, more so than their doctrinal content. They bring philological rigor. So these are people formed by the late 19th century university, the Humboldtian University, to a kind of terrifying standard of academic rigor and philology. Get to know every text, get to know the root of every word, and produce very sober, very correct texts, right? That are adhere to the standards of philological science. Okay, don't just make stuff up. Don't just quote things that you've heard. Get it tied down to the texts. And that's a kind of idea of total scholarship, right? That you are the expert on your field and you know everything that there is to know about it, as well as what you don't know. You know where there are gaps in your knowledge. At the same time as this university academic ideal is embodied by a number of these people, they also tend to have a nighttime participation in the thing that they study. So while there's this academic ideal of objectivity, of scholarship being detached from what one sees so that you can see it clearly, these scholars tend to be people who have moved one foot across that line of objectivity. If they read about a practice in Buddhism and Hinduism, they will try to do it, many of them. And they don't talk about that in their texts because that could get them into trouble. But they do talk about it here. They talk about their experiences, and not just as scholars and experts, but as practitioners. So practice is what they describe as something explained in the text, but also something that they talk about as something they've done. They've undergone some of these transformations. So again, this is what's getting formed here. Not people who translate what they do into Jung's terms to say these are all manifestations of the collective unconscious, but they attach their knowledge to Jungian notions as part of a conversation, as part of an environment, as part of a milieu, a shared ambience. So the first feast, you could divide up the schedule. They've been happening more or less uninterrupted since 1933, but you can divide up that calendar in a few different ways. I'm going to focus on the two first big blocks of time, sort of 20 years each. And the first feast start from 33 and continue through the war. As Olga says in 1939, these conferences deal with the experience of the soul among all people, both in the Orient and the Occident. So when I hear that this conference was organized by East-West philosophy, I mean, this is exactly what she's doing, right? And even that terminology I think, goes back to Eranos. It's to shed light in a psychological sense on parallels and differences between the two parts of the world. It's like a circle with doors leading to the different spheres of knowledge. And in the middle, we have psychological research, a unifying analytic function. So here it's Jung. These are people invited in 1947. She's kind of planning the dinner seating, but it's also which intellectual knowledges are represented here by whom. And OFK, Olga Fröbe-Kapteyn, at the center of it. And the two of them really are the driving forces. She does all the organizing, she chooses people, but together they discuss what the kind of final list will be. And Jung is there. He does speak fairly regularly at Eranos, but he is not running the show. He's often in the background. He's kind of the key audience member in a lot of ways, and will contribute to the conversations, but it's not he who says, and now for our next speaker, this person who I've chosen. So he's in the background letting it unfold to an extent. Maybe you can glimpse and see some of the main titles here, but this is to give you a sense of the who's there, the intensity of these conferences, right? These are very serious lectures that go for 2 hours. And I'll tell you a little bit more about who these people are in the first years. Heinrich Zimmer. Sorry? Sure. And these are the tables of contents of the Eranos yearbooks. So there would be a publication, or there would be the event, and then a year later a publication that Olga herself edited. And these are still available they're hard to read because they're in a number of different languages. Spoiler, there will be an English collection, but more on that in a second. Sure. So who are these people? Heinrich Zimmer, a very famous Indologist and art historian of South Asia on Hindu myths and Buddhism. He's the teacher of Joseph Campbell, actually. His wife was Jewish, so when the Nazis came to power, he moved to New York, which is where he meets Campbell. When I showed this to a Buddhist scholar friend of mine, he couldn't believe that Carolyn Reese Davids was actually at Eranos, because she and her husband are the founders of the Pali Society. They're the people who translated Pali text for the first time on a large scale into English. So they really brought Theravada Buddhism into English conversation. She wrote, very interested on jhanas, which are high-level absorption meditations in Buddhism. So this is 1890s. Incredible what she's doing. Astrology is present through Sigrid Strauss-Klobe. If anyone knows more about her, please let me know. She's not easy to learn about, but the psychological meaning of astrology is on the cards. Friedrich Heiler, a religious scholar interested in the gift and also interested in religious practices. He actually trained, while he was at Eranos, he led everyone through a meditation protocol based on Christian teaching, the Christian path of contemplative revelation. So this is one indication we have that they weren't just talking about their religious experiences, they were actually having religious experiences, or at least starting these practices. And the way in which this is one version of how this gets integrated with Jungian understandings is suggested by Erwin Roussel's work. He is a translator of the Tao Te Ching. And what he literally translates Taoist meditation into Jungian terms. There's a communication between consciousness and unconscious. A new personality is formed, an integrated person, integrated with himself, fellow men, and the cosmos, right? Not just individual, but cosmic integration. The unconscious must be accepted for the building of the new man. So this is a case in which there really is a very clear translation into a Jungian language. In addition, we have representatives not just of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, but Christianity, a quite radical preacher who gets defrocked because an Italian priest who is defrocked for refusing to take the fascist oath in 1931. Representing Judaism is the legendary Martin Buber. They're talking about the sacramental practices of Hasidism. And there's a picture of him in his swimming suit in Lake Maggiore, which I'm not sure if it'd be appropriate to show, but it's like, it gives you a sense of the kind of collective effervescence of the place. Now, this is 1933. The Nazis take power in 1933. And there's a long conversation to be had, and that has been had, about Jung's involvement with the Nazis, how much he is complicit, supportive of the Nazis, at what point does he draw the line? And I refer you to these books, which discuss these questions in great depth. He in 1933, Jung, becomes the president of the International Association for Psychotherapy, which is undergoing the process of removing non-German members from it, which is to say Jewish members. He then makes it possible for an international group to show up, to enter into the association, which he says is to make sure that Jewish members can still practice. So he has said afterwards that he wasn't doing this just for his own professional interests. He wasn't becoming the leader of this German organization for psychoanalysis just for his own professional interest. He was doing it in order to protect the Jewish members of Jewish psychoanalysts. But there are some ambiguities, like his writing about the difference between the Jewish and the Aryan unconscious. But by 36, he's writing some very critical texts about Hitler as embodying this dangerous archetype of Wotan, someone who has possessed a whole nation, rolling towards perdition. By 1939, when World War II does break out, Jung resigns. And Olga Fröbe-Kapteyn wanted Eranos to be politically neutral, right? So that it wasn't a Nazi organization, but it wasn't an anti-Nazi organization in those first years, as the Nazis were rising in power in the 1930s. And we can't not talk about this shadow. Even at the first meetings, there were scholars who were very close to Jung who would become Nazis explicitly. Gustav Heyer writes about the soul as organism and joins the Nazi Party. Apparently, he would meet his patients wearing his SS uniform because that was somehow that would, yeah, I don't know what his thinking was on that. I haven't asked. And Jakob Hauer, who's one of the experts on yoga, on Hindu yoga, wants to be the leader, the Führer actually, of the German faith movement, which will be German paganism plus Hinduism and an Aryan Christ who is not coming in peace, but a warrior Christ. He's not asked back after 1934, but he is definitely there in 34. And he and Jung in the 20s had given lectures on Indian philosophy in Zurich. So that's part of the picture, at least in the first years. Another part of the picture is the funding. How is this happening? Now, Olga has an inheritance, but it's far from infinite. Jung met many people on his journeys, including Paul Mellon, who is the grandson of the train supplies empire founder, and Mary Mellon above all, his wife, who is completely taken by Jung. They go to Zurich, they go to Eranos, they go to Bollingen, Jung's tower. They create a publication series to publish Jung's works, as well as most of the works of Eranos scholars. So the Mellon money is very important. It dries up during the war because there's an embargo on trading with the US, trading with Switzerland, for fear of some of that money winding up in Axis hands. And that really affects who can be at Eranos. Sometimes there are meetings of just 2 or 3 people at their annual meetings, but they continue. And by 1942, Olga expresses some hope that the tide has turned, the creative forces have taken over from the destructive ones, and Eranos will bring forward the new age. Right? What's coming out of the war is a new possibility for humanity, and Eranos will give birth to it. So the second big chapter of events at Eranos, after that first one, is where it really reaches its heyday, where it really takes shape in a way that is now known by us scholars, recognized as having a kind of predictable pattern. And some of the big figures there are signaled here. This is from 1950, one of the first events after the war. And Jimena de Angulo, a really interesting character who's part of this circle, writes to Olga that at this point, now the lecturers take the concept of the archetypes for granted. They are all speaking some of the same language, and they are realizing this hasn't been said before explicitly, what she sees as the main project of Eranos. This is a very post-war ambition to create a new universal human science. And Eranos is going to help to do that. I mean, this is the era of Levi-Strauss and structuralism. It's the era of cognitive science. It's the era of cybernetics. All new attempts to synthesize the human sciences in a single form, and the possibility that Eranos' particular blend of history and experiential mystocentric religious scholarship might be another way of uniting the human sciences. So I'm going to go through this quickly. These are all people who have huge bodies of work. Yeah.
If you can mention Roberto Assagioli in there somewhere, or there.
I can talk to you later, but yeah. I think maybe you can tell me about Roberto. These are some of the scholars who are certainly in religious studies recognized as benefiting from Eranos and representatives of Eranos. One is Erich Neuman, his work on the Great Mother, all of the different archetypes that the mother can take, some terrifying, some comforting, all polarized and set up in this incredible diagram. This is borrowing directly from Tony Wolff, who is also present at Eranos, but doesn't get credit. There are very few female speakers, about two for the first 30 or 40 years. And there's things that can be said about Olga's psyche along these lines, about who gets invited. But Tony is there. Erich Neuman is also drawing very much on Olga's own work in collecting the Eranos archive, which is a collection of images of the collective unconscious. That's how I actually learned about Eranos, because one of the two versions of the Eranos archive is at the Warburg Institute, where I work. Another one is in New York in the Aras collection, A-R-A-S. They're still there, and you can see the images that Olga created or brought together with Jung's influence. Henri Corbin is there as well, a scholar of mysticism and Sufism, who talks about the imaginal as a domain where you interact with things which are not neither real nor imaginary, mystical beings, and spends a lot of time there. Gershom Scholem, friend of Corbin, friend of Jung's as well, who writes about Kabbalah and its symbolism and the mystical traditions in Jewish thought. Kind of the poster boy for Eranos in the second period is Mircea Eliade, a Romanian religious scholar who wrote dozens of books comparing religious traditions around the world and bringing them back to experience. Right? What are the experiences and ritual forms that show up again and again, return in all religious traditions? He writes about the myth of the eternal return, that the true religion, original religion, archaic religion, is connected to the cycle of the seasons. All rituals reflect those cycles, as well as the daily, seasonal, and annual renewal, as well as the life cycle of humans. These rituals bring you outside of ordinary time to an atemporal, eternal time. Christianity and Judaism have fallen away from that sense of eternity as they're moving towards an eschaton, a revelation, an apocalypse. And this was a better way to experience the world. The fusion of eternity with ordinary time is the coincidence of opposites. He particularly sees this in long studies on shamanism. This is archaic religion, which offers techniques of ecstasy. So again, mysticism and experience are at the heart of the religious for him. Another less known figure from Eranos is Paul Radin, but you know him by his work, which is the trickster, an amazing anthropologist who's got a hilarious and really wise view of how different personality types are and how many different versions of different stories there are. He himself is a trickster and really undercuts some of the grandiosity of an author like Mircea Eliade. They didn't get along very well and really represent two kind of different poles for understanding culture. It would be important also, I think, sorry. This is the talk he gave this is Radin, the talk he gave at Eranos, The Religious Experience of American Indian, which is based on his field work with the Winnebago. And some of the people he studies are undergoing, obviously, the destruction of their culture, but it's the moment of the rise of the Peyote religion, the Native American church. So he interviews and analyzes the experience. It's a beautiful text that analyzes the experience of John Rave, who is the founder of the Peyote Native American church, which is a syncretic religion that replaced a lot of the traditional indigenous beliefs and practices, but was a kind of pan-Native American movement, which is focused on the sacrament of ingesting peyote, built on a kind of mystic experience. One of Radin's distinguishing traits as an anthropologist is that it's always about people's stories. It's always about getting to know who that individual is, not what that culture is as a kind of structure, but what have you lived? And also setting that experience in time, in history. This religion showed up as a result of colonialism, as a result of the expansion of European settlement. It's an amazing text. So if there's one recommendation I'd make, it's for that.
And I think that we're about to go to Q&As. So
Yeah.
if can let him just wrap up, and then we can go to
Yeah. So I'm going to zip through some pictures, okay? Just to give you a sense of this second chapter. This is the heyday of Eranos, and then some quick thoughts about how it reaches the mainstream. So thanks for keeping me honest, Yusuf, keeping me on my toes. It's important to know that there are also scientists here. Adolf Portman is there, and he is a biologist who writes about the organism and the soul of animals. He's very interested in how do animals perceive and think. And Erwin Schrödinger's there, the famous quantum physicist. And it's at Eranos that Jung first presents synchronicity. So the attempt to make a new science that incorporates human sciences, natural sciences, especially the radical views of relativity and quantum physics, along with the history of religions and psychological experience, that synthetic aim is there. And the sciences are not excluded, they are at the heart of it. And Jung himself is pushing for that. And works like this, the Tao of Physics, the Dancing Woolly Masters, even Jeffrey Keupel's The Flip, follow from this convergence. So here is the formula, I think, that's emerging in that second moment: an atmosphere of archetypes, interest in religious history, an emphasis on individual experience, an openness to the reality, the imaginal of Henri Corbin, of these entities that are encountered, what you might call a soft polytheism, right? Yeah, maybe there are lots of gods. We don't know how many, but they're probably out there. And you yourself can make your own syncretic religion. You can put your own religion together out of your own reading, out of your own experience, an interest in physical science, and perennialism and traditionalism are at the edges. So again, very quickly, roots to the mainstream, this guy. Joseph Campbell edited the first Eranos volumes. Zimmer suggested him as the editor. He did it badly, in Olga's view, for the first couple of years. They had these terrible fights over in letters. Finally, they invited him to speak there, and then he got it and put together this series. They're back in print at Princeton University Press. He then goes on to talk with George Lucas, write The Power of Myth, makes the series, enters the mainstream widely. As you all know, Alcoholics Anonymous is another route through which the emphasis on religious atmosphere, right, which Jung suggested to someone suffering of alcoholism, that's what they're cultivating, right? How do we think about these religions, taking them seriously, as though what they're saying is true, right? That's what he prescribed for AA. Then, if you'll forgive me in this group, I think one of the routes through which these ideas reach the mainstream is through Jung cultivating the art of the self-serving introduction. Okay, so for an incredible number of really important works that brought Eastern philosophies and religions into Western conversation, he figured out a way to be the guy who writes the foreword and say, this is basically depth psychology. This is basically archetypes. This is basically what I've been talking about. He does it for the I Ching. He does it for Taoist meditation. He does it for Vedanta with Ramana Maharshi, introduced by Carl Jung. He does it for the Tibetan Book of the Dead with a psychological commentary by Jung, an introduction to Zen Buddhism, forward by Dr. Carl Jung. And Suzuki actually was at Eranos for 2 years. So he's right there in the milieu. The favor is returned based on the Book of the Dead by Leary and Alpert, who say what they're describing is basically a Jungian process in the psychedelic experience. Esalen brings a lot of these ideas together in a single place, which is now where we are, right? This is an outgrowth of it. And Richard Spiegelberg, who we just heard about, was at an Eranos meeting in the 30s or 40s, wrote about it in the press, told Murphy and Price when they were going to learn from Aurobindo, wanted to combine that with Western science, wanted to combine it with psychology, that what they need to do is create an Eranos on the West Coast. And basically that's, with a few modifications, where we are now. Thanks very much for your attention. So yeah, please, any questions? And it's a vast undertaking, so in many cases, I really have no idea. So
And so,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I warned you guys that he was an amazing speaker, right? If ChatGPT had a human young analyst, I think it would be this voice you just hear answering the questions. So,
thank you.
so we are gonna have, is anybody hungry? We're offering lunch today at 12:30. And so we have a little bit more time. So we're gonna do some Q&As until then. But we still want to be mindful of the length of the questions, right? Because we're going to be asking questions online, and then we're going to be asking questions in person. I believe we're going to be able to hear the questions online. And I'm going to walk up to you guys so the mic can be closer to you, and I might repeat the question so the people on Zoom can hear it.
And where is
So
lunch? I'm sorry.
lunch is going to be in the cafe on the third floor, which is right across from the Namaste Hall where the keynote speaker was.
So questions.
Okay. I don't think I have a choice. Okay, yes.
Okay, this is a little more, I'm older, I went through the 60s here, et cetera. But what has been really exciting for me is that my mother was a metaphysical minister, and she was all into Alice Bailey and the whole, I've got texts. That was that part of it, and the transcendental thinkers and stuff. You get to psychology, you get the depth psychology and the Jungian stuff. And it's just, I've been curious about Eranos for so long because I've heard about it for so long. So to see that whole lineage, I had no idea that the Alice Bailey stuff was brought into that. So it just feels like this wonderful waving, tapestry. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
That's so gratifying to hear. And I think that it's not that people became Jungians, but Jung is part of this milieu and then puts a spin on it.
Yes.
And takes these things that are already out there, ancient traditions, but also theosophy and New Age, and says, here's a way to communicate amongst them. That's great to hear. Thank you.
All right in the front.
Fabulous, like fantastic presentation. So
Thank
thank
you.
you. You mentioned Olga had her own kind of psyche in choosing participants.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little more on that?
Yeah.
So this is about Olga and the psyche,
her
and how
how did she choose her
chose.
participants? A lot of the first, it was sort of by invitation, people would make suggestions, but a lot of the first batch were people that were at the Count von Kaiserling School of Wisdom. So she met them at that conference and said, we went to all of them and said, we'd like to have you at our conference. And actually, Rudolf Otto, the idea of the holy, said, oh, you should do this. You should call it Eranos. I'll write the letter of introduction. So that's just the mechanics of it. Her own psyche gets into it. Well, she wants the people who are most interesting, but they are all men. And she has tricky relationships with women. I mean, that story with Alice Bailey is, gives you a taste of that they were incredibly close. And then there's this, like, she went too far. She crossed some kind of boundary, and she's kicked off the island. She has two daughters, twin daughters, one of whom is disabled and is seized by the Nazis, actually, and eugenically murdered. Right. So there's this kind of tragedy behind it, behind her relationship to everyone around her. Olga, the woman I mentioned before, Jimena de Angelo, the one who's in conversation, she becomes her kind of secretary. She's the daughter of Carrie Baines, who is the translator of the I Ching. Her father is a guy named Jaime de Angelo, who is a Spanish doctor and anthropologist and linguist who winds up at Berkeley and is one of the heroes of the Beat movement. So she's incredible. She winds up in Switzerland, and she's very devoted to Olga and is always kind of talking her down. She's like, oh, actually, I think Joseph Campbell's trying to do the right thing. Don't fire him yet. But then they have a break. And she once writes that Olga is the strangest person she has ever met. Exactly in what way, I don't know, but she's very extreme, very intense, very sure of herself, and it has these very heated exchanges that then become ruptures with people.
Okay, and oh no, is it okay if we take one from
Sure.
online so we can try to? Hey, Alex. Alex is our co-host. If you guys say hi to Alex.
Hi,
Um,
everybody.
can we hear you? Can you speak so we can make
Can
sure
you hear
you
me?
guys can
Yeah.
hear me? Okay.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. So I have a question from Neil, who says that clearly there is both light and shadow to the Eranos conferences. But what do you think it was that made Jung's idea such a powerful vector for the flourishing of so many diverse thinkers and traditions?
Well, hopefully we'll be looking at that, for the next 3 days. But I think it's, first of all, his willingness, right, to listen seriously to the experience of other individuals and other traditions. He went through his descent into hell, and he's reaching to Gnosticism. He's reaching to ancient Greek. He's reaching to Dante, but also Hinduism and Buddhism. And he wants to know more about these traditions to make sense of his own experience and the sense that there's a universal truth to what he's talking about that's grounded in the universal unconscious. And I think it's that openness that he knows that he's working in a Western tradition. He knows that he is a medical doctor in Zurich, but at the same time, he doesn't say, he refuses to say that the other paths are less true, right? This is the path he has to take, but these other paths, these other histories have to be listened to. And Richard Tarnas's talk, I think, was great on this point. Sometimes he is not listening as much as you'd like him to. Like he's translating a little more into his own language. Weirdly, he goes to India and Sri Ramana is there, Ramana Maharshi, this sage, he's there. He can't be bothered to meet him. He's like, I think I know what he's going to say. I'm like, you had a chance to meet this enlightened being and you just stayed in your hotel room. So, but there is a kind of openness that I think is at the heart of it, and the ability to integrate not only the range of what's in the psyche, but the range of what's out there in other traditions and other experiences, other myths, I think is why it works, why it lasts.
Okay, so we have time for a few more questions.
Great.
You wanna?
Well, there's a hand just went up in the back.
Okay.
I'm curious, why did Jung stop attending the Eranos conference?
Well, I thought it was because he was kind of ill, and he has a heart attack. But from what we just heard this morning, I think he was too busy writing books. He was, from this in his 70s, it sounds like he wrote a number of books. But yeah, no, it's a very demanding thing to be there for 7 days in a row. And I think he said physically he was not up to it. And he was there, up until quite late into his life. Yeah, beyond that, I don't know. I don't know. He and Olga had their tussles as well. I mean, they had their fights. Like he was always, they all got drunk and he like took the ring off of a bottle and said, "We are now married. We're like spiritual husband and wife." And she quoted that back to him, and he more or less said, "I don't remember any of that." So it was an unequal relationship, as it often was with Jung. So that might be part of the story too. Yeah.
I have a question about Jung not releasing the Red Book until 2008 and that sort of night side. Were people who went to Eranos and experienced that sort of night side, were there any sort of like, don't talk about this outside? Because I know like the Jung family was very protective of sort of that material. And then, since 2008 and the release of the Red Book, have you seen a lot of people shift their view of like Jung's more kind of occult, spiritual, kooky aspects?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think I don't think I could have I can't write about this in the way that I'm writing about it without the Red Book being published, because this just takes for granted that it's not a pure science, detached medical science of the mind, but it's very experiential. And the Red Book is a way of unlocking this aspect of Eranos as well. I don't think you would have needed to say like, don't tell anyone that I'm not just writing about Sufism, but I'm an initiated Sufi. I don't think in 1950 you'd have to tell anyone that. Like that, if you want to be a respected academic, you don't go waving that flag. So I think there's a sense that they all knew to keep it fairly close, and Jung as much as anyone, right? That he was still speaking in the language of the psychologist of the academic. But they also really cultivated this notion. They did a lot of publicity. Olga got, you know, like the German version of Time of Life magazine did a feature on them on Eranos with like great black and white photos and in interviews with everyone in the 50s or 60s. So they were publicizing it, but the publicity often emphasized the esoteric nature of the meetings. Like it's exclusive. There's only room for 50 people, and things are discovered and uncovered there that you won't find anywhere else.
Okay, we have a couple more online, if that's okay.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Alex.
And if anyone wants to go to lunch, that's fine too.
Yeah, lunch is ready,
Yeah.
and so you guys can feel free to it's ready a little early, so we're yeah. So Alex.
Alex, yeah.
All right. So Jen asked if you would speak more to the Esalen hostess's art, Jung mentioning that it was too crisp in the edges, and maybe more on the similarities to the work of Hilma af Klint.
Yeah, a lot of people have been noticing those similarities between Hilma af Klint, recently rediscovered, and in part not known because her work wasn't modern art. It wasn't White Cube Gallery. It was an expression of a theosophical ambition, right? It was, I'm going to build the church. I'm going to build the temple that will bring all the souls together in their unified ascent, which didn't fit into the language of modernist art. Now, modernist art has room, maybe a little more room for that, and can say these paintings are amazing in formal terms, and the meaning of them is important as well. So there have been people who have said Olga's work should be considered much in the light of Hilma af Klint's work. And I don't know quite what to say stylistically, except that in a way, Hilma's work is between the two. You could kind of see it as a synthesis of those two moments in her work, in Olga's work, that the post-Jungian paintings are all pastels, very flowing, very, 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 there are no lines. It's all lines, it's all geometry. And Hilma's is kind of, things are flowing, but they have edges. They don't, it's not about vagueness. They didn't know each other, but they are figures with a very similar trajectory. One branched into art, one branched into the history of ideas and philosophy.
Okay, so thank you, and we have a little bit more time, so maybe one more in person, one more online.
Sure, or three very quickly.
This is a quick
Okay.
question.
Yeah.
If you can hear me, I just was curious who took over after Olga died and Jung.
Yeah, Adolf Portman, the biologist, the Swiss biologist. So he ran it for another 10 years plus, and I think did a great job, in part because there were so many like religious scholars, and he was sort of an outsider, so he could be quite fair. He wasn't in the midst of it. Then one of the more lengthy people in charge was someone named Mircea, who was a scholar of the I Ching, and strangely, I think it's in the 80s, decided that really what Eranos ought to be is just I Ching studies. And then that created a fissure in all the people connected to it, and they're still kind of recovering from that.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have. They're back, you know, up and running. But there's a sense of not being sure what the lineage is and therefore what the mission is.
And it's more organizational than one person.
Yeah, it's not just one person. I mean, there are two.
Okay. Do
Please, yeah. Oh, yeah. Maybe you have one online, and then we have 2 or 3 in the room. Yeah.
Okay, so
And I won't answer it. I'll just wait till I'll
Alex.
answer this one, but then the other 3 will just stack. Sorry.
There's actually a question in the chat that I think follows along with that really well. Rachel was curious as to what is going on at Eranos today.
Yeah, so they're having annual meetings, and a lot of them are very exciting. They're on topics like earth symbols or philosophy of freedom. It's mostly in Italian because in order to survive, they've connected themselves to the local base, which is Italian speaking, and with a lot of connections to Italian universities. And there's more of a philosophical rather than mystical or psychological orientation. But one of the secretary of Eranos, not the person in charge, but the secretary, Roberto Bernardini, is a Jungian analyst and wrote a great book about Jung and Eranos. So I think he's bringing that back in various forms. But they are alive and kicking, so worth visiting. So from within the room, let's take whatever questions there are, or quick ones, and then I'll try to answer them together.
They were having a lot of experimentation. They were doing drugs. What drugs were they doing?
Mescaline?
Can you repeat it? So
I was just curious about which drugs they were doing.
My bet would be hashish and mescaline, but I don't know for sure. So that's worth looking into. There have been great movies about Monte Verita lately, where they're like, this is the birth of the new humanity, and people have recognized the connections between Monte Verita and the 60s. There are 2 films and books about them.